Wow. Is everyone having a good day? Yeah. Pretty good so far, huh? That was a great keynote. I thought it was too short, so that topic could have gone on easy another half hour, in my mind anyway. How many people here use Windows as their primary computer? Windows. Raise your hand. Be proud. Come on. All right. You see this guy raise his hand like this. How about Mac users? All right. Any Linux people, full-time, desktop computers? All right. None. So
desktop, not full-time.
That's what we're here to talk about today. So I've asked this question in many sessions that I've done, attended, not even presented at, to just see how many people are using Linux as a desktop, and it's surprisingly small. I rarely get one person raising their hand. Unless I'm in the session, I raise my own hand. So I switched to Linux about 18 months ago, and have been pretty pro-Linux since then. But it's actually the second switch I've done in my life from an operating system. And when I switch, I really go all in. By the way, I'm StephenCross. I have a podcast about Drupal called Talking Drupal, if you want to check that out. We're a little bit behind, a few months behind, but we have some more episodes coming soon. I'm one of the organizers of this camp, and I have a website that's extremely outdated, but there are presentations on there. There's a version of this presentation sitting up there that I did probably about 6 months ago, and I'll have some updated slides that changed a few things since then. So you can feel free to grab that presentation there. This is a picture of me and my wife when we got married in 1990. This is my first wife. She doesn't like that joke. If you registered this morning here, she was at the desk when you came in. And I can see there's a couple of people out there trying to do the math. It's 29 years that we've been married. And what's funny is we actually met in this building on the second floor in calculus class in 1985. So for that same person who's trying to figure out the math, does anyone know what number that is? That's 34 years ago.
I think that's a differential, isn't it?
So I've had a great marriage. I have two great daughters. They're both in their 20s, moved out of the house. But marriage is hard, right? Has anyone had a hard marriage? You have ups and downs. And there was a love affair. I have to admit it today. And like many love affairs, it starts with a little bit of curiosity, a little bit of intrigue, and then it comes really unexpectedly. He was so charming and smart. I fell in love with this guy back in the 90s. This is a joke, by the way. So you can insert laugh here. He was a great salesman, a great visionary, and he kind of changed the world that we're in today, right? The iPhone, the Apple products have really changed the way we live in today's world. And I was a Windows developer at the time, had Windows computers, hadn't really touched the Mac, although they had been around a long time. And the first Apple product I had was in 2004. Was a a mini iPod. This thing sold like wildfire. After the big one, this little one came out, and people were buying them like crazy. MP3 players were super hot at the time, and I received this for, I think it was a Father's Day gift or a birthday gift. And I quickly fell in love with how simple that product was and how good it worked. And I soon after that bought a Mac Mini. This was a product that was for people like me. It was made for people who were using Windows machines and wanted to kind of tinker with trying something new. They sold just this. They still sell them today, but it was intriguing at the time because you could just stick it on your desk, which is what I did, plug your current keyboard and monitor into it, and get a taste of what the Mac was like. And that's what I did. So I sat all day long doing Windows. I was doing Windows client-server development. Anybody ever heard of a product called Progress? Okay, there's a Progress guy. I didn't know that, Matt. So I was doing client-server development on a Windows machine, and I had this little Mac Mini sitting on the side, and I just started tinkering with it. Within a couple of months, I had figured out how to move my Windows machine to the other side of the desk, and the Mac Mini was sitting in front of me. And I was the outlier of all the people in my industry. No one was using Mac for any of that kind of development. But I kind of fell in love with the ease. It worked so great. And it was shiny and new, which is something that I'm generally attracted to. So in 2007, this is the first photo I can find of me with a Mac. You know, I actually was looking for a me with a Mac photo. This is the first one. I think that's my first laptop. And if you notice on the table there, if you zoom in close, you notice, anyone know what that is?
It's a BlackBerry.
Yeah, BlackBerry. So I was a BlackBerry, a Trio user. I had all the new products that came out, man, I had them. If it's shiny and new, I like it, and I still do that today. And which is what I did 18 months ago when I started to tinker with Linux as like a real computer to use. But now, there's no more Macs in my house, which is hard to believe because I've had every shape and size. I don't even want to try to figure out how much money I've spent on them during the years. I had all the iPads, iMacs, laptops, different versions. And as you can see, usually when I take pictures, my cats are hanging around my computer, so I have lots of cat pictures. And I have a lot of family pictures with the laptops and the cats together. So as a family, my kids grew up with Macs in grammar school, in elementary school, and moving up through. There was never a Windows PC that they ever remember. And we'd hand them down like anyone would. And we actually took a pilgrimage once to New York City to visit an Apple store. All right, that's how much I was in love with this. But then, love went on the rocks, right? What happened to me? How could I switch after being the Apple guy in the family after all these years? Well, there's many reasons, so I'm gonna really focus in on two today. I'm gonna talk about why I made a switch and the reasons why I think you as a Drupal developer should considering switching and how to do it. So my first primary reasons for me is Apple's direction. So as a company, they're a profitable company. They need to make their shareholders happy. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So I have two reasons: Apple's direction and then professional development. I used to watch every single Apple keynote that came out, even after Steve left. And this phrase was always used. This is the most beautiful computer we've ever made. This is the fastest computer we've ever made. And actually, this was the announcement that came out a week and a half ago with the new MacBook Pro 16-inch. I just want to highlight a few things there. This is designed for those who defy limits and change the world. That's me, right? I'm going to defy limits. I'm going to change the world. And this is the most powerful notebook they've ever made. The one that came out 2 weeks ago. It's got a super fast processor, and guess what? It has a magic keyboard. I mean, this is sexy marketing. Who would not want this product? Right? This is how they sell it, and this is what I bought from them for years and years. And I started to get sour on Mac in the past 3 or 4 years when the products, the hardware that they were coming out with, that had been, it's still beautiful hardware, it still works great, but they've started to not have their operating systems run on this hardware that runs perfectly fine. And from my mind, there's only one reason you would do that. Like, if you have a 2012 or older Mac computer, it doesn't run the last 2 versions of the operating system. Which means you can't even upgrade to the latest versions of the Apple products. And this hardware is perfectly good hardware. So in my opinion, Mac, and I started feeling like this way 3 or 4 years ago, that they started to choose like beauty over function, started selling stuff, and their products were more focused at consumers, not professionals, with the disappearance of the different ports on the computer. You basically have one now, you have no choice. There's no choice for you, and they're disposable. They really want you to buy a new machine every 4 years. But the funny thing is, if you look at the hardware specs on the computers from them that are 9 years old, are they really that different from today? If you go into Best Buy today and you look at their lower end laptops, like the ones for $300 or $400, They've got like i3 and i5 Intel processors in them. That's what these Mac computers had in 2010 and 11. So I started to feel like Apple was just getting tons of money from me, often, for no reason other than to line their pockets. This is not to bash on Apple products, although that's kind of what I'm doing. But it really got me thinking about things. So that's my first reason, to start to look outside at a new product. The second one was professional development. Let me explain that a little bit. So if you're a Drupal developer, which I assume most people in this room are, you have some certain skills that you need. You're using PHP, JavaScript, Twig, CSS, design. You could be a front-end developer, a back-end developer. And the changes that have gone on in our world from a Drupal dev side over the past 4 or 5 years with these modern workflows. We're using Docker and DDev tools and front-end builds and CI tools and continuous deployment and integration. There's a lot of automation going on. And if you look at this automation and the things you need to do as a Drupal developer today, you need to be DevOpsy. I mean, you can't be a Drupal developer and not have some DevOps skills. I know some developers are kind of pushing away from that. They just want to start it up and just go with it. But you really have to have some skills today in the Drupal world, in any developer world, I guess, but we're focusing on Drupal. You need to know at least a little bit about virtualization environments. You need to know a little bit about continuous integration. You need to know how those things are working. Those things are all working under Linux. Linux is the operating system that all of these tools in the modern workflow world are working under. It's working under Linux. When you fire off Docker on your Mac, it's running a Linux kernel to make that happen. Our production environments, is anyone running a production server in Drupal that's not running on Linux? Because I usually get 1 or 2 hands for that, but I'm not getting it today. So our production environments are running on Linux. Our local development environments are running on Linux. I start to think to myself, if I work in Linux, because I've been on Mac for so many years, it's getting me closer to the deployment environment that I'm using. It'll get me more comfortable in that deployment environment, working in the command line, working in Linux. And I'd probably be a better DevOps person if I got off of Mac. That was sort of my mind thinking. And it's exactly what I did. And I believe that you'll be more valuable to your team if you switch to Linux. And I think I'm proof of that in the current environment that I'm in. I didn't introduce myself in terms of the work that I do today, but I'm working for the federal government in the Department of Justice, and I work on public-facing websites. And we have a Drupal team, and over the past, when I started there, I was on a Mac. Over my time working with DOJ, I have slowly transitioned into the DevOps guy. I was uncomfortable 2.5 years ago in DevOps. I really didn't understand it. I was kind of like pushing away, hey, I don't want to deal with that stuff. Moving myself to Linux got me more comfortable in that environment. Now I'm the guy managing and bug fixing and dealing with all the DevOpsy things. So I'm more valuable to my team and just more valuable as a developer. So those are my 2 main reasons why I switched to Linux. So let's do a little bit of what is Linux. I'm guessing most people here have a pretty good understanding what it is, but there could be some things here that you're really not aware of, which is surprising. In working with the Department of Justice, and specifically the ATF, my team, they're buying new equipment this coming year to replace our old Macs. So I went to them and said, hey, by the way, why don't you give developers a choice of choosing Linux or Mac? Can we go ahead and do that? Well, it took a little bit of proposals from me and some pros and cons, and then the cost difference between an equivalent Linux machine and a Mac. And as of a few weeks ago, they gave us an option to, as developers, when we get new equipment, do we want to work on Mac or Linux? And this actual machine right here is the one that they bought me, which probably brings me up to about 5 Linux laptops at this point. So what is Linux? Well, it's an operating system just like Mac and Windows, and people often don't think of it like that. They think of, well, is Linux popular? Well, here's some stats. Linux runs on 100% of the world's 500 supercomputers. 95% of the servers that run the world's top 1 million domains are powered by Linux. You can see these stats here. 85% of all smartphones are based on Linux. Why is that?
Android.
Because Android is based on Linux. This stat, I wasn't sure I believed when I saw it, but since it promotes my my mission here, I'm going to use it. I found that 54% of professional developers are using Linux this year. I think that covers not just web developers, but all of the development world. And all of the websites that I work on run on Linux. So it's everywhere, though. Linux is absolutely everywhere. It runs your TiVo, your Kindle, car and in-flight entertainment systems, self-driving cars, smart refrigerators, washing machines, air traffic control. The U.S. Department of Defense is the largest installation of Red Hat Linux in the world. That. So Linux is really everywhere, and basically, if something has a computer chip, it's probably running Linux. So if you look around the room, though, you'll see that everyone is pretty much running a Mac. So where did Linux come from? Well, comes from Linus Torvalds. I'm assuming a lot of you know who he is. But it's kind of interesting to think of such a powerful operating system that's running the majority of this world. This guy is only like 49, I think, if I do the math quick here. He lives in the US. He was born in Finland.
53.
Is it 53? Thank you.
69. It's 19, it's 2019 now.
50.
So he's turning 50.
50. He's turning 50, yeah. He's also created Git. So we all use Git. A lot of people don't know that he actually invented that as well. And Linux is open source. So Linux is developed and supported by over 200 companies, many nonprofit organizations, thousands of developers. Nobody owns it. It's an important point here. It's important for a couple of reasons. One is that anyone can modify it and do what they want with it. Anyone can change it to be what they need it to be. I also think that no one owning it has caused it to not be very popular in terms of desktop use, because there's no money to be made by installing Linux on a computer and selling the computer. No one makes any money with that. They're only making money on the hardware. What's beautiful about Linux is if someone has an idea and wants to morph Linux to fit their needs, they can go ahead and do it. These are called Linux distributions. So there are thousands of Linux distributions out there. There's Linux that has been customized to work well for people who are doing multimedia work. So they customize the operating system to meet those people. It's been morphed to run on Raspberry Pis on small computers. It's been morphed to run on an Internet of Things device. But at the base of that, it's all basically the same Linux kernel. So this is very high level about what makes up Linux. But you've got your hardware at the bottom here. So that's your, whatever hardware you happen to be running it on. Then on top of that is the Linux kernel. The kernel is the piece that interfaces with the hardware. Then these distributions are sitting on that talking to the kernel. In the Linux world, when you choose a distribution, you're kind of choosing what kind of desktop environment you want to have. You're choosing the way you want to interact with the file system. There's lots of choices, and that's one of the problems with Linux, is that which distribution do you pick? And what you'll learn over time as you start to get into Linux, you realize it doesn't matter which distribution you pick, because you'll switch distributions because The operating system has turned into an app like any other app. You run this distribution today, a month from now you may you may uninstall your operating system and reinstall something new. That's unheard of in the Mac and Windows world. It's like this gold thing that you don't touch and you just keep upgrading. In the Linux world, it's really unlike that. These distributions have sort of come up with the idea that, we always used to say there's an app for that. Well, there is a Linux for that. So what that has done for me and does for other people, it gives you lots of flexibility. And if you think of flexibility, you can think of it in a couple of different ways. One of it is in today's Drupal development world, we're kind of operating system agnostic now. If you're running a Docker environment or a virtual machine, some kind of environment, it almost doesn't matter what operating system you run on, right? And that's what one of our goals has been with DevOps is, right, to take that application and this guy can run it on Windows, this guy can put it on Mac, and you just download the stuff, you start up the environment, and it's running the same everywhere. That's kind of like the philosophy of Linux for a long period of time. So the idea here is, as we move from, we take our containered environment on a website that we're using with Drupal, we know that we can take it and put it in this machine and get up and running. No problem. So what if your operating system was the same kind of model, that you could put it on anything and just have it run, like you do with your Docker containers with your Drupal app? So when you're using Mac operating system, it only runs on Mac hardware, period. You have no choice, right? If you want to run Windows, you can run Windows on many different pieces of hardware. It's very flexible in that way. The nice thing about Linux kind of takes that a step further in my mind, is that you can have this operating system that you're comfortable with and run it on almost anything, on any size computer. It's really your choice. So let's say you get comfortable with Linux. Try it out, you get comfortable with it. In your office, you want to have a big, beefy computer to do your work and be very productive. So you set up that environment. But you really want this kind of junky little laptop that you have, you don't spend a lot of money on, and you want to keep that in your car to take to Starbucks. You can run the same exact operating system on that laptop. No one's telling you you can't, you can just put it on there. You want to go into your office or your family room where your kids are and maybe have a little bit more beefier computer that's really good at running games. You run Linux on that thing too. So you get the same operating system, you can be running it on any size computer, any shape, any size you want. No one's controlling that. So you've now controlled your hardware choices because you chose Linux as your operating system. Like for me, I like a laptop that has an SD reader, and I like multiple USB ports. I can't get that on a Mac unless I buy an old one. But I can get a laptop that I either buy at Best Buy that has Windows on it and I just stick Linux on it, or maybe I buy something old that has that device. Like I can pick and choose the things that I need, and it's not dictated by any company. There are companies that are shipping Linux on hardware today. This is one of them, System76. It's a US-based company. They make their own hardware, and they ship only Linux on it. They don't do anything else. That's what their business is. There's a few other places you can do that today too. Dell has a computer line, a laptop line for developers that ships with Linux. The advantage of buying hardware that ships with Linux on it, especially if you're new to Linux, is you know it's just going to work. You're not going to have to deal with any issues. And if you do have to deal with any issues, you just call tech support. So when I first started to look at Linux, I took the advice of many people that said, hey, listen, buy a piece of hardware that has Linux installed on it, and you'll have tech support available to you. And I bought one of these things. So this is kind of like the same strategy I took years before with the Mac Mini. I took the same strategy with Linux. I bought this thing from System76. Like it's a little, it's like a Nook. It's basically the same. If you know where the Intel NUC is, it's that hardware that comes with Linux shipped on it. I did the same exact thing I did 15 years earlier. I put it on my desk, I plugged the monitor and keyboard into it, and I kind of tinkered with it every once in a while. Within a month or so, I had done the same thing I had done with the Mac when I was collecting dust, and the Linux machine was there. It's a great way to start. What I did learn, though, is that I really didn't need a lot of support from System 76. The problems I had, I just did a Google search, and there was tons of support out there, which got me really confident and brave in me choosing Linux and then exploring new distributions, not just the one that it came with. So I started to tinker around a little bit. One of the nice things about a company like System 76, like I said, it works out of the box. You got the customer support, and you have that level of confidence that allows you to move forward, especially if you're like me and I'm depending on my computer for work. It's not the same thing as the computer that I'm going to kick around and go to Starbucks with, but it's a computer that I'm going to rely on every day. So the System 76 was a great choice for me. So where's the big challenge comes in? It comes in here, is the software side. I call it breaking the chains. Like if you're considering seriously to moving to Linux or considering it, you have to look at your software. What software are you using that won't be available to you on Linux? Would that stop you from moving? And that's what I was afraid of, and I didn't realize it until I had the Mac on my desk and the Linux machine at the same time, realizing that I had to make very few changes in my life and in the software that I used so it could be compatible. So I say break the chains, and one thing to think about just moving forward, even if you're not going to switch to Linux, is when you make software choices, you should be making choices that are cross-platform choices. Try to do that wherever you can, and then you won't be stuck under one vendor. So some examples of that. So for me, what does it mean to break a chain? I want to make sure that any software choices I have will work on, I don't care about Windows, I'm never going to have that again, so that's not even an issue for me. It needs to be a Mac, or it needs to run on Mac or Linux, and I have to have it available on iOS and Android. Those are decisions that I use. I use those 4 platforms as ways I might want to change, because I'm not saying I'll never use a Mac again. And I have an iPhone today, but I could be using Android in the future, because I have in the past. I make that switch every few years back and forth. So pick software choices that run on all those operating systems. As a Drupal developer, so if I make a list of the things I need as a Drupal dev so I could run it on Linux, well, I need Docker to run. Yeah, it's all set. It already runs there. It actually is native to Linux, so that's not an issue. Drupal VM runs on Linux. It's a little hard to tinker with. It's got its problems here and there, but it does on Mac too, by the way. An IDE I was using, when I first switched, I was using PHP Storm. No big deal, Linux version, just move your license over. I've since switched to VS Code. Not a problem there, that runs on both environments. So this is not a tool that I use here, SQL Pro, but I did a couple of surveys to see what tools developers use. I'm a guy who uses a command line to get to SQL all the time. I guess some people use GUI tools. So this was an example where I didn't have an answer. So what do? Just go out and do a Google search. Just say, hey, I need a GUI SQL tool that runs on Linux. I quickly found something like this and found that there's 50 others like it too. So that wouldn't be a problem for me either if I had to switch over. There's a great website that always pops up when you're doing this kind of search. It's called Alternate 2, and it gives you, hey, if I want this kind of software, here are the options you have in different platforms. Here's the Windows version, a Mac version, etc. The next hurdle, these are the hurdles that people always bring up. What about Office products? Well, I use Word all the time. Can I switch over to Linux? Well, there's a product called LibreOffice that is open source, and it runs on all the platforms. So if you don't have real intense requirements for your for your Office products, like you're doing basic spreadsheet, basic word processing, you should be ditching your Office 365 subscription already and installing this. It's free and it works great, and It's much simpler. It's like maybe the 8 or 10-year-old version of Word in terms of interface and simplicity. You're not hunting around in the menus and trying to figure out where things are. It's just where you'd expect it to be. There is another alternative called Free Office. This is not open source, it's proprietary. But if you're a Word person and you interface with Word people all the time, this has 100% compatibility with Word. Where LibreOffice is a little bit like this. It might not always look exactly the same. Question?
Do you know what happened to OpenOffice? Because I never heard of FreeOffice. I know LibreOffice is a fork.
OpenOffice, I believe, and LibreOffice are the same product now.
It's a fork, yeah.
Yes.
Oracle.
Yep.
Anyway, I don't want to get into
Yeah.
it. I was just curious whether. So
FreeOffice, I think, is a relatively new thing.
Okay.
But they have subscription model too, so they give you basic functionality, but if you really want like mail merging and things like that, I think, you got to pay their $10 a month.
Okay.
But it does run on Linux and it works great. And you always have online versions of stuff if you need to go in that direction. So where do the tires fall off? Everyone knows where that is, right? Anyone guess where you really run into trouble? Right there.
Yeah, Adobe.
Adobe products do not run on Linux. There is no intent for them to in the near future.
Unless they move to a web.
Unless they were to move to a web thing, but who knows?
Which they tinker with, but is not functional at this point.
If you are a design person, Linux probably isn't the best place for you to land if you rely on these products.
Right.
Are there alternatives to these products? Yes, there are. Are they as good as these products? Not even
No,
close.
they are not. But the GIMP for Photoshop,
Yeah.
Inkscape for
Exactly.
Illustrator, and Scribus is actually very good for kind of InDesign type of stuff.
So I've been using Adobe products for years. I know Photoshop really, really well. I've been able to do most of the stuff I need to do in GIMP, which is another open source. It's available on all operating systems, but it's nowhere near as good as Photoshop. So what are your choices?
Well, for the web, GIMP is good, but for print media and you need Pantone
it doesn't.
and
So
stuff.
Photoshop is what do they call it? Undestructible, or you can. Yeah, whatever. I won't get into the details of it. But what if you don't have any Linux options? Well, if you're on Windows, you have a few choices. This applies to Adobe or any other products that if you're looking for a Windows compatibility, you could always run Windows in a virtual machine, which is what I'm doing on here right now, if I have to get to Illustrator.
Oh, wow.
So I just basically fire up Windows Pro version in VirtualBox, and I get into Illustrator. These badges, agendas inside, is for me doing Illustrator on this machine in a VirtualBox.
Wow.
Wine is another choice. Wine is a layer between your Windows application and Linux. It's not an emulator, but it translates the APIs. So you actually install Wine, and then you can run the Windows applications on your Linux computer. And it runs really good. It's usually behind many versions. So like if you're on, I don't even know what Adobe's on now. I don't use it as much. Is it on 8 or 9? The Wine version of it may be back on 6 or 7 kind of thing. So that's an option for you too. And the third thing you can always do is find alternative software, which is what I've been able to do. I found that outside of the Adobe products, anything else I wanted, there were many more options in Linux than there were in Mac for me, for software that I want to try. If you have Mac software that you rely on and you want to switch to Linux, you are out of luck. You have to find an alternative. There's no reasonable way to run Mac on a Linux, the Mac OS. There are ways to do it, but nothing reasonable. Nothing supported by Apple. So you're kind of stuck there. So some of my alternatives were simple. The Adobe Photoshop, I'm using GIMP. I was using Audition to do my podcast. I've switched that over to Audacity, which is an open product that runs on all platforms. I probably should have switched to that years ago anyway. And unfortunately, because I do have Illustrator needs every once in a while, I still got to pay that Adobe fee every month. I did drop Office 365, but I'm still paying for Photoshop and the Creative Suite, but rarely using it, unfortunately. This is an example of the wine library. If I was like looking for Illustrator, I don't know what the current version is, but it will tell you like which versions are and the users of the tools rate them on how good wine supports those particular models. So, if you're considering transitioning, I suggest that you sort of get comfortable with it first. Don't jump in, or don't blow away your hard drive and install Linux on your Mac. All right, that's not advice that I have for you. I would poke around at things, and I'm going to show you a couple of ways to do that. And I actually went down this route of trying an experiment. After I was like kind of 6 months into this, I started to think to myself, well, could I put together a Drupal developer laptop that I could do my day-to-day work in for under $300? That was my goal. So I went to Best Buy and I was kind of looking, trying to figure out which of the newer cheap laptops, the ones in the $200-300 range, would be the best for me to buy and just install Linux on it. So I went on to a bunch of forums that I was familiar with in Linux and said, hey, which laptop do you recommend I do this with? And all the feedback was, don't buy a piece of crap at Best Buy because it's not worth the money. Go to eBay and buy a laptop, like a ThinkPad or something like that, that's high quality computer that's maybe 6 to 9 years old. Wow. You're going to get better quality than what you're going to get today, and you're going to pay less money for it. So that sent me on a mission to see what I could get. Well, it turns out I did it for under $100. And I've done it like 6 times or 7 times since then as well. I went on to eBay, looked for a ThinkPad 420. I don't know if anyone knows the ThinkPad models. This is the last one. They're very popular and very high demand because it's the last one with the clickety-click keyboards before they switched to the butterfly keyboards. So I bought one of these for $45 without a power cable, and without it had a hard drive, and I wanted to put an SD in it. So I basically, and it had 8 gigs of memory, which is the minimum I would take. So I put $45 for the computer, $36 for an SD card, $11 for a charger. Under $100, I had that computer up and running. And I've done this a number of times. My wife now has one that she uses. My daughter uses one now. They've all switched over to Linux. And these are really high quality machines that run super fast.
Was the SSD also from eBay, or was that new?
I bought it brand new on Amazon. I buy them all the time now. You can get them for between $20 and $30 for 128 gigs. So my sister, another story like this, my sister has a 2012 Mac Mini. Beautiful condition. She called me a couple months ago, said, this thing is running too slow. What can I do? Can I put more memory in it? And I said, well, tell me what's in it. Well, there's 8 gigs of memory in it now, but it's like taking forever to even start up. So I said, we probably need to put an SD in it. And she says, yeah, but it also won't let me upgrade to the current iMovie and that stuff. I can't upgrade it. So her laptop is current with all the latest stuff, but her Mac Mini, which the family uses, is now like 3 years behind on the software. So I said, can I put Linux on it? And she says, will I be able to use it? I'm like, yeah, let's give it a try. So I ordered one of those SDs for $20, put it in that thing, fired up Linux in it. In 20 minutes, that machine was running like it was brand new. It's an i5 processor. You know, it's 4 or 5 generations old, but it's still good quality hardware. And that's what she's been using for about a month with no issues whatsoever. So it's a good way, I bring this up, it's a good way to get moving if you want to do this. Not spend a lot of money and put yourself in the right direction. So another way to get started here, and this is what I recommend you could do right away, is Linux distributions always have what they call live ISOs. So you go to any Linux distribution website and you can download an ISO file, which is a CD image, and you burn it to a USB stick. And if you boot your computer from that USB, you can run that distribution right from there without installing it. Because, you know, Mac and Windows, they're like 8 gigs, 15 gigs to install them. Most Linux distributions are under 2 gigs. So it will run from your USB and do all the stuff to to play with it and try it out before you actually install it on the bare metal. It's a great way to play with it. And if you like it, then you can just hit the install button and say format, and then you're off. So this is a great way to do that. The one note here is there's a product called Etcher that runs on Linux, Mac, and Windows. That's a great little software tool that will burn because the USB needs to be a bootable disk. That software will take the ISO and make a bootable disk out of your USB drive. So, in summary, what time do we start? I'm close, okay. Linux is not for geeks only. It's not a command line tool. These are all myths. The GUI, if you haven't seen the Linux operating system from a graphical perspective, it competes and is better than Mac and Windows these days, depending on which distribution you want. If you want one that looks and functions like Mac OS, you can get a distribution that looks like that. If you want one that looks like Windows 98, you can get a distribution that looks like that. So you can make your choices about what your desktop looks like, but underneath it's all the same. So my advice is, take a look at this direction, take control of your choices with your operating system instead of having companies like Apple controlling you and controlling your pocket. Grow your skills. Moving to Linux has allowed me to do more work and be more valuable to my customers because now I'm a DevOps guy, and that's only because I got comfortable in that area. And if you're going to spend some money, you can go spend $800 or $900 and get a really good laptop and get Linux installed on it. It's a great way to get started. This particular computer here has basically the same specs as the current MacBook Pros out there. This was $1,600 with 3-year warranty. The equivalent Mac was like $35 when we priced it out. And this thing has way more flexibility in it. I have, not to go too much into selling this product, but it has multiple USB drives in it. It has an SD card reader in it. That's pretty cool to have. It actually has 16 gigs of memory, but I can upgrade it to 64. You know what I have to do to upgrade it? I just unscrew the bottom of it and plug the stuff in. Those days are gone with Apple. That's years ago. Yeah. I have one hard drive in here, SD card. I can actually put 2 more in. So I could have 3 SD cards in this machine. So this machine, as long as I don't kick it down the stairs, is probably good for 10 or 15 years. That's not an exaggeration. Not that I don't want to upgrade it before then, but this machine is here. This is going way past the 5-year life cycle of Apple. There's no question about it. Yeah. So I encourage you to fall in love again and switch to Linux. Any questions? Question? Yeah.
What do you use for mail?
Yeah, great question. So it says, what do I use for mail? So I have Gmail is my mail provider, but on this particular laptop, this distribution had something called Evolution Mail. So I installed that. On my other laptops, I have Thunderbird installed. So you have lots of, when you purchase a when you download a distribution and install it, they usually have their flavor of software that would come pre-installed for you to choose from, but you can install anything you want. So I have different mail programs running on different computers because I tried them.
It doesn't matter because it's IMAP.
Yeah, it's IMAP mail, so it doesn't really matter what it is. Yeah.
Always check it with the browser, but you can also, if you prefer to IMAP synchronize it, there's definitely different.
The other interesting thing is, so on my team, I'm the only one running Linux right now, and we do Zoom calls a lot, and we're working with other developers. My Linux machine is running all the stuff so much faster than the guy sitting on the Macs, it's killing him. Like when I fire up Docker and run, do a Lando rebuild, it happens in seconds as opposed to minutes.
You should point out why that is so slow on the Mac.
It's so many layers of stuff on the Mac.
Because it has to run a virtual Linux.
Yeah, it's running a Linux kernel within the Mac OS, which is within Unix. I mean, it's crazy.
Because Docker is just containers, right? It doesn't need full virtualization. If you're already running Linux as your base OS, then you only need to, Docker just needs to containerize, like it's doing system calls through the container to the, in
Yeah.
other words, you don't need to fake your Linux before you can run the Linux inside the container. You've already got it natively, so it's super fast compared to
Yeah.
running.
It runs a lot
we used
faster.
Lando at the last place I worked.
Yeah.
We use Lando for all of our local dev, and it's slow on the Mac sometimes. It
Very
really
slow,
is.
yeah.
And the person on staff who had switched, which is Nate, who's going to
Yeah.
be giving a talk upstairs later, but he was so much faster, like right away running it on Linux.
I thought it was a file system.
What would you say
That
is
might
the
be what it
biggest-
is, yeah. It's something that it has to virtualize, that it has to, I don't know, we can look it up exactly.
What would you say
what
is
it
the biggest difference between the ThinkPad solution you talked about in that machine? Is it performance or like features like the screen display?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the question was, like the 2012 ThinkPad that I have a couple of in this, what is the big differences? Well, expandability. So first, this machine is clearly faster than the ThinkPad. The ThinkPad I could use, it was equivalent to the Mac. I was running a 2015 MacBook Pro, 16 gigs of memory, and working in a Docker environment. The ThinkPad is just as fast as that, equivalent. So this I have a little bit more flexibility. I could expand it, and someone else paid for it. I mean, I bought my own one of these. I spent about $800 a year ago. I still use that one as well. This one doesn't have a Retina display. I don't really need that. So, geez, I hate to say it. There's not a whole lot of difference between this and the 9-year-old ThinkPad in terms of day-to-day work, other than generally faster and more expandable. Any other questions? Yeah.
How many of your developers do you think will switch?
That's a great question. So we have 6 people on the team that can switch to Linux. And I did a presentation at the ATF about 2 weeks ago, similar to this. And when they came, everyone came out of this presentation, they're like, we are definitely switching to Linux. There's no question about it, we're switching. Then the ad came out for Apple, the new 16-inch Apple, and some of them are going, oh boy, that thing, it's got a magic keyboard.
It's an
I mean,
extra inch.
what's that?
It's an extra inch. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
It's the biggest MacBook Pro they've ever made.
It's the best. I mean, that's why I highlighted that marketing piece up there. I don't know. I don't know what they're going to switch with. I think it might be split. Budget does make a big difference. Although the MacBook Pro, the new one seems to have come down in price. It seems like it's cheaper than it was in the past. Yeah.
What about your kids and your wife? I mean, what was the
Yeah.
onboarding versus onboarding for them?
Yeah. So
How
that's
tall were you, I guess?
that's a great question. So
Repeat for the recording.
what's that?
Repeat.
Oh yeah, so the question was, what about my kids and my wife switching to Linux? So I switched my wife over and didn't give her a choice. I wasn't like mean about it, but I'm like, hey, I'm like doing all these Linux talks. Could you just give this a try? So I installed a distribution that is like, they call it like friendly for new people. So I switched it over to that. And she really has had no trouble with it. If you asked her today, would she rather have a Mac? She'd say yes. There's no doubt. She just got a new job. She starts in 2 weeks, and they're giving her a MacBook Pro. She's excited. But she will also follow up with saying, I don't dislike the Linux. There's nothing about it I hate, but I just like Mac. So I think it's, there's an emotional connection. It's all those things, right? Which makes sense. I mean, those things make sense. So, and my daughter's fine with it too. I mean, 90% of what people are doing today, they're doing in a browser, right? They all have a browser and they all run. So what is the real difference? It's the additional software, those breaking the chain section that I was talking about, those things that you use that you need. My wife does everything in a browser, so she hasn't really noticed much. And she's using the free Office, not the LibreOffice, because she needed 100% compatibility with her Word documents. And she's had no trouble with them whatsoever. She goes to school, she's a school teacher, she opens up the Word documents on a Windows machine, saves them in a Dropbox, opens them on a Linux computer at home with no problem whatsoever. So that was like her big pain point, but it was no issue whatsoever.
A lot of the Office suites have the online versions now.
Right.
So for most features of those applications.
Right.
You have all the features available.
Right.
Some things you can't do, but for the most part, you know, with an Office 365 subscription through work, you know, you can just log in right from a browser and do.
That's what makes that 9-year-old ThinkPad so attractive. Because once you run Linux on it, it's like a fresh new computer, and most of your time's in a browser, and it's going to run great. And no one will know the difference otherwise. And I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much.